I don't think there's anything more important than this. We had a public square. There was a lot of very ugly speech in it, to be certain. However, we have to pay that price. The founding fathers knew we had to pay the price of vile speech in order to protect difficult but necessary speech.
Bret Weinstein just slammed the right-wing attack on the First Amendment and free speech through Attorney General Pam Bondi's call to prosecute crimes against hate speech. So he gets into the importance of free speech in a free society here and why we can't endure this. We have to refuse to comply. Let's listen. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Hey, folks. I'm feeling pretty out of sorts this morning, and I want to take a crack at explaining why. I'm watching several different things unfold. One of them is that Jimmy Kimmel has apparently been fired by ABC, and that has a lot of people who, under other circumstances, would be champions of free speech cheering for his cancellation. Now, I'm not arguing that his cancellation is a violation of his free speech rights. It's not perfectly clear, but obviously he's privately employed, and so the First Amendment doesn't apply directly. You could argue that because he's on public airwaves that the First Amendment does apply, but there are certainly limits of what's allowed on television. So let's assume that there is no constitutional issue in the Jimmy Kimmel cancellation. There's still a question about whether or not we want to make certain topics undiscussable in the public square. And as much as X has been discussed as the public square, it is also true that things like broadcast networks function as a part of the public square. And we can't have sacred topics. We can't have topics that are off limits. Now, I don't like Kimmel one bit, and I did not resonate with his joke. But the concern is watching people who know the importance of speech rallying on the opposite side of the fence. That, however, is not the most important issue that's got me concerned. I also saw a story about an AI engine, private, that is being employed, the claim is, by all platforms, including X, to spot anti-Semitism. What it does is nominally remove anti-Semitic tweets. When I ask Grok if it's active and if that's all it does, I'm told it is active and that that's not all it does. It also deboosts tweets.
And by the way, it's always the case that, the people in power conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, critiques against Israel and the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And that's a big concern here when you're talking about hate speech and how it could be weaponized. Because guess what? They called the protesters, rallying on the side of Palestine and against the side of Israel on college campuses, just all anti-Semitic. Despite the fact that it was mostly a critique of U.S. foreign policy and bankrolling this genocide in Gaza. But I think this is a fair conception. There's a lot of dynamics in play here. It looks like the FCC pressured ABC and its parent company Disney to apply the pressure on Jimmy Kimmel to get him to stop. But it's also true that Jimmy Kimmel's ratings were plummeting. He had 129,000 viewers in the period in which they judged that, which is extremely low. And what was happening here is you had several of Disney's rebroadcasters, including Nexstar and Sinclair, apply the pressure too. They did not like that this was happening. Now, I don't think the FCC should exist. I don't particularly like Jimmy Kimmel either. I don't want the government entwined with private companies and throwing its weight around, just like I didn't like it when Democrats were in power. But it seems like this gives, Disney an out. This guy was failing, and now it seems like the liberal establishment might have a propaganda victory here that even though, his show might have inevitably gone down just like the rest of the legacy media, just like Don Lemon and just like Joy Reid, this is the worst possible scenario.
Now, there are multiple problems with this. One, while I know from my own work as a biologist going back decades that anti-Semitism is, in fact, special as a process, it must never become legally special. In the West, and in the United States specifically, our laws have to be indifferent to who is facing judgment and over what. In other words, we are entitled to equal protection under the law. And that means if something is intolerable, then it has to not matter who it is said about. Either the speech is intolerable because, for example, it incites violence, or it is protected. You can't have a special class of speech in which the topic or the subject, the people in question, are the reason that something crosses a line. That's true at the level of law, but it must also be true at the level of the public square.
Yeah, it's selective and arbitrary, and he's exactly right here. When you just carve out government protections for one group on the basis of, policing hate speech, guess what happens when a different power gets in office? They just hurl it at their own political opponents. They enforce it in different ways, and that's what we'd inevitably see here. Because they called, a lot of the left wing, I should say the liberal establishment and the Biden administration and people in government, prominent politicians, called every Trump supporter insurrectionist. And they pushed the big, January 6th insurrection narrative. And guess what? They prosecuted a lot of people on that basis that dared to protest. Some of them didn't even enter the Capitol on January 6th, including a grandmother that was forced to wear an ankle bracelet and have, intense penalties thrown at her. This is what happens on the other side of the shoe. And when you set precedents like this on attacks on free speech and just pervert and violate the First Amendment, it's never good. It wasn't good in 1798 when the Federalists passed the Sedition Act, criminalized, ill-conceived supposed judgments against the president and members of Congress. You'd be criminalized, facing at least 2 years in jail, up to 2 years in jail, I should say. In 1917, the Espionage Act sought to do away with protesters of the Great War. Maybe the most disastrous thing to ever happen to that point probably was. That's what you get from this stuff.
The second reason to be concerned is that AI is nowhere near capable of doing this job with the level of nuance that would be necessary even to do what is advertised, that is, to detect true anti-Semitism. Think for a moment about whether or not you've ever seen AI make a proper joke, something really funny, something you would laugh out loud if a comedian said it on stage. AI isn't up to the challenge, and that's because humor is actually highly complex and very difficult. So how exactly is an AI that is incapable of making a proper joke supposed to distinguish between jokes, irony, paradoxical claims, hypotheses? The answer is it can't. Humans can't, and AI has not yet gotten to the point of being able to do the job of an intelligent human.
That's a good point, and I don't think humans entrenched in power can either, because again, they define anti-Semitism in a lot of different ways in our society, and the ruling class certainly defines it differently than I do in my society. It seems like you get penalized more for criticizing the government of Israel, the vile criminal government of Israel in my mind, and things like the genocide it's perpetrating, including that and lumping that in with anti-Semitism. When, hey, my ideological influences as a libertarian are overwhelmingly Jewish, actually. Murray Rothbard, Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. Today you have Spike Cohen and Dave Smith, spitting truth against power. And that is the case. But when you weaponize this against individuals, it just violates their most basic rights. This truly is the cornerstone of a liberty-oriented society. Because you can't even make informed choices in your life or your job or your friendships if you aren't given information. And when people are too afraid to share information because of the iron hand of the government, that's a bad thing for everyone.
So what are we to make of the fact that Elon, by his own accounting, purchased the right to free speech for $44 billion when he bought Twitter, and he is now apparently allowing an AI engine to regulate what can and cannot be said on the platform. Further, as we discovered during COVID, as soon as you carve out a right to regulate speech based on its content, then whatever definitions there are that dictate what is allowed and what is forbidden will be altered and modified to do the bidding of whoever controls that algorithm. Let us not forget that during COVID, we discovered many people imagined there was an exemption to the First Amendment and to other amendments surrounding public health emergencies. That's simply not true. As Kennedy has pointed out multiple times, the Founding Fathers were well aware of the danger of public health emergencies and made no exception in the Constitution for one.
This is exactly right. Actually, there were several smallpox epidemics that were deadly that broke out during the War for Independence or the American Revolution, and vaccines were never mandated upon the populace. Now, it is true that George Washington did favor inoculation for the Continental Army, made that a distinction, but that's in no way conducive to the idea that this was a obligation that the public had to endure. And if people come to believe that variolation, as it was called there, and not necessarily vaccines, I don't think that word had even started yet. You know, that was adopted in various places that believed there was value in it. It's like if the government doesn't have to tell you that water is healthy to drink. We know. We've experienced that. We know that. But when they push something like this, there's always should be eyebrows raising. And Bret's exactly right. And this is no different from, just a few years ago when basically every three-letter agency under the sun allied with big tech to censor users for disinformation about the COVID regime, questioning the efficacy of cloth masks, pushing the idea that this might have come from a Wuhan lab that, by the way, got funding for gain-of-function resource from the NIH. If you said that, you would be, completely destroyed, censored. Prominent accounts were removed, like Alex Berenson, for this. That's what happened, and that's where this is going if this sticks. And it doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans pushing it. It's just a different flavor of the uniparty censorship regime.
But people's belief that there was such an exception allowed them to relax their protection of our most fundamental rights. And having done so, definitions were modified. I would point out that, in fact, anti-Semitism has been, in recent memory, proclaimed as a public health emergency by public health officials. So if you think it's far-fetched that using an AI to remove anti-Semitic content or prevent people from seeing it on X could lead to other topics, we've already seen the prototype.
Yeah, absolutely. And he didn't mention this, but his friend Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has pushed that idea that anti-Semitism itself is a public health crisis, from the HHS director weighing in on that as if it was a public health crisis that needs to be solved somehow by central government forces. That's a horrible idea. And, there might be some redeeming things about Kennedy, certainly some things he said about free speech. That's good. But they're clearly setting up a censorship regime just aimed at this particular flavor of censorship, the idea of anti-Semitism. And Pam Bondi spoke to that. She said hate speech, is a different category than free speech. Never having read the First Amendment or the Constitution, apparently, never actually looking into the context of how that was argued, looking into precedents. No one in, the first hundreds of years of the American government believed that Congress could assume the role of pushing that, or the executive branch could assume the role of pushing that. Not at all.
Now, I shouldn't have to say this because having been through COVID, we should all be familiar with the argument. But the fact is, Western civilization depends on free speech more than anything else. This is why it is our first enumerated right. We have to be able to talk about what is taking place in order to figure out what to think about it, and more importantly, what to do. If topics are taken off the table, then we are incapable of even knowing what the citizenry thinks. That is an intolerable situation, and it cannot last. So once again, we find that the West and our democratic republic are jeopardized by those who would narrowly target free speech in order to solve a particular problem, either because they are willing to let the West fall or because they do not understand the connection between the First Amendment and its preservation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm glad he makes such a good connection between the importance of free speech and actually decision making. It's something that often a lot of people don't talk about in relation to this. It's just like, you have this free expression, and that's an extension of your own property rights because you own yourself, and it's important for you to say what you feel, right? That's like the big cornerstone argument for this. But Bret goes further than that by linking it to informed decision making as a result of free speech. I think that's very important. The only thing I would challenge is like him saying our democratic republic is threatened by this. I'm sorry, that is such an idealistic utopian view of the current government. We have a despotic oligarchy in Washington, D.C. that rules outside of the law, that has special carve-outs, that makes it immune to murder charges when it, levies all these crazy, endless wars overseas, bombing campaigns against Iran, overthrowing Gaddafi, overthrowing Assad on behalf of, by the way, Israel and Al-Qaeda in Syria. By the way, the new leader is an Al-Qaeda emir, former fighter, founded the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. It was called Al-Nusra. I can go on and on. It maintains an extortion apparatus to steal from us, but if I stole from you, I would get charged for that. They can have premeditated murder in the drone wars. They've killed American citizens over there. Obama did, and he never answered for it, but he killed a 16-year-old boy in, I believe, Yemen. And this is the runaway government we have, where corporations and government get in bed with each other to benefit from it. This is not a democratic republic. I'm sorry to say. It's supposed to be a republic, but contrary to Benjamin Franklin's warning, it's a republic if you can keep it. We couldn't keep it very long, could we?
I hope people understand how important this is. And although there's a lot going on in the world, I don't think there's anything more important than this. We had a public square. There was a lot of very ugly speech in it, to be certain. However, we have to pay that price. The founding fathers knew we had to pay the price of vile speech in order to protect difficult but necessary speech. So let's sober up and get back to our job of protecting the West, because we and future generations are depending on it.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. I'll resist and won't comply with, hate speech codes, whether they're pushed down from a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, because let's be honest, it's all really the same. There's striking continuity in our government between administrations for all the theatrics and optical differences and attempts by the media to portray them as clashes of ideology. They don't really manifest that way. As it turns out, both tribes want to wield the power of the state against their political adversaries, against causes they don't like. And guess what cause they don't like most of all right now because of its influence in our government? Criticism against Israel. That's just to be honest. And TikTok was just purchased there's in the works to purchase TikTok by a purchasing group that includes people like Larry Ellison and Mark Andreessen, both devout, zealous Zionists. Larry Ellison being a former IDF soldier, by the way. And one of the reasons there was such an attempt to squash TikTok, make it cease its operations in the United States, was because they allowed pictures and videos to come out of Gaza. That's not something that the legacy media has done. That's something that we were getting out of TikTok and, Instagram and social media. They just can't hide it anymore because the old media is dying and the new independent media is rising. They want to try to stop whatever they can. But this is really reminiscent of the Biden administration establishing a Ministry of Truth. Remember this? This became a total meme on the right, I think rightly so, when you had this commission set up to police against disinformation and ostensibly harassment. Just take a look at this.
Speech, and the Biden administration has announced the creation of a disinformation governance board.
We address disinformation that presents a security threat to the homeland. Disinformation from Russia, from China, from Iran, from the cartels.
But while the administration portrays it as a source for good, the DGB has many people concerned.
We in the Department of Homeland Security don't monitor American citizens.
You don't, but will this board change that?
No. The board does not have any operational authority or capability.
But guess who does? The NSA, the PRISM program, as Snowden revealed, and Palantir's attempting to expand that to aggregate information from many other government agencies too. But anyways, this became a total meme on the right. You got these awesome memes. It's the year 2033. The Ministry of Truth destroys the last existing meme. This was awesome. This was spread for, a week or two on social media. I loved it. I mean, this was so ridiculous. And I just saw such good outcry from various people, especially on the right, about this, some of which that are remaining totally silent now, unfortunately. Thankfully, there has been some opposition on the right to this, but, we got these awesome memes showing the stupidity of this, and there was such public backlash that this commission couldn't really take form. They didn't have the political capital to do it, and that's telling in Washington, where they get away with doing a lot of things that large swaths of the public don't like. So that's where we're at, man. I mean, we just can't endure more of this censorship regime and just accept it when our own tribe favors it and deplore it when the opposite tribe favors it. That's not the American way, and it's no way to maintain liberty in a free society. We can't weaponize speech against hate because the government, always the arbiter of hate, gets to define that term, and when you do that, you inevitably open Pandora's box to anything and everything the government doesn't like being called hate speech. That's the truth, and that's what has to be shut down. Doesn't matter if you're Democratic or Republican, you have to abhor this. You have to deplore it, you have to reject it. Non-compliance, it would be well within your right to do that. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below. Is Bret Weinstein right about this? Is this something that needs to be resisted at all cost? Is free speech a cornerstone of the West? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Bret. Thanks for the podcast, Bret. I think Bret has the right idea here. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support my channel. I'll tip my hat to you, and in return for that, I will give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.